Hey, this is Wes. In this video, I'm going to texture this asset in Substance Painter. I'm going to create an underwater scene, and I'm going to render a portfolio image using Iray in Substance Painter, and then upload that directly to my ArtStation. So if we look at this asset, this little prop is going to be the high-res mesh. So I'm not going to, have a low-res and bake a normal and all that. I'm just going to work directly here from this kind of mid to high poly asset. And then here I have this core mesh part. You'll notice here that the material is set to core. So I have a core material. This is the rings. So I have a rings material. Here I have the tube weeds. So this is, again, has a tube weeds material. And then finally I have the ground, which is just a ground plane. So when I export this FBX, each one of these materials are going to become a texture set inside of Substance Painter. So here we are in Substance Painter, and the first thing I'm going to do is create my project. So File, New. In the new project, I'm using the PBR Metallic Roughness template, and then here for the mesh, I'm going to just browse to my underwater vent folder, and I'm going to grab that vent.fbx. So we'll click Open here, and I'm going to leave everything at default except for this document resolution. I'm going to start this at 2048. So now we'll click OK, and this here is going to load up the mesh and create my Substance Painter project. And so here's what we have. We have our mesh. Here we have our texture sets with our core, ground, rings, and the tube weeds that we had. Now I'm getting a little error here, which is just telling me that some mesh normals are invalid and they'll be recomputed, and that's fine. If I don't want to see this message, I can now just right-click and just choose Clear, just to kind of get that out of the way. Okay, so here is the overall asset ready for us to start working on. Now, I'm going to also import some new resources into this project that I'm going to need. So here in my shelf, I'm going to click this Import button, and I'm going to go to my Add Resources. And here in that same folder, I have here these two JPEGs. This one here is just going to represent my overall environment that I'm going to use, which is going to take care of my lighting. Now, this is just an image that I found online, just doing a quick search. This is actually a low dynamic range image, so it's not an HDR, but that's okay. It's going to work, and it's going to provide me that environment that I need for this underwater. And then I also have this rust. So again, this was something I just searched out really quick, just found a rust. I didn't even care. It's not tiling or anything. I just grabbed it. So we'll grab these two guys and click Open. Now for the this one here, this is my environment. So I'm going to tag this as an environment. My rust, we're going to tag this one here as a texture. Now I have one more asset that I want to use. So I'm going to choose Add Resources. Here I'm going to come over to my downloads, and then I'm going to grab this Desert Sand Dune SBSAR, and we'll click Open. And so this here is a substance that I just downloaded from Substance Source. I'm going to use that for my ground. So here I'm going to tag this as a base material. Now, I have these resources ready, so import your resources too. For this option, I'm going to choose to set this to the actual project itself, and I'll click Import. And then here you can see that my resources have been added. Now, again, for this desert ground, I use Substance Source. So here at the top of the UI, there's a Source button. And so this will allow me to browse Source and then download content from Source directly. So if I just, for example, do a search, if I do Dune, this here is the material that I found that I thought might work well for my ocean floor. And so if you have access to Source through a subscription, this is a really good way to get textures quickly. Okay, so now that I have this set up, I'm going to start to set up my environment. So here, if we come over to our viewer settings for my environment map, I'll click my button here. And then again, this is that image that I downloaded, added into my project. We're going to use this as our environment map. And so if I hold down Shift and right mouse, I can rotate the environment, which again, like I said, this is going to represent my lighting here. And this is going to provide me kind of this underwater look that I'm kind of going for. Another thing that we're going to end up doing with this here that you'll see is if I come over here to my display settings and I enable my post effects. So if I turn on things like, so here I'm going to do my vignetting, and then I have this glare. So I'll turn the glare on. Let's pull our luminance and our threshold down. So you'll see that once we start to get this, once we start getting all our textures together, I'm going to use this glare to help create this underwater perspective that I'm going to need. And it actually kind of helps a lot. So we'll use this a bit later once we have all of our textures in place. Okay, so more on that, like I said, later. For now, let's go back to our texture set settings, and I'm going to bake some maps that are going to help me throughout this texturing process. So here I'm going to click my Bake Textures. Now, I'm not going to bake a normal. As I said, I don't have a low res and high res. I don't care. I'm just working right off the high res, really. So for the output size for all these maps, I'm going to set this to 2048 by 2048. I want to bake a world space normal. I don't have an ID. I don't need that. I need ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and I don't need thickness. And then I'm also going to use low poly as high poly mesh. I'm going to enable that setting. And then I'm just going to bake all my sets here at the same time. So my option here, bake all texture sets, it's going to do just that. So we'll click this button, and now Substance Painter is baking away, and it's going to create all the maps, and then it's going to throw them here into this additional map slot. And again, these maps that I'm creating, like curvature, position, these are all going to help me with my mask generators and stuff. Again, just help in the texturing process. Okay, so here you can see that the baking has finished. The most apparent map that we can see here is our ambient occlusion, and it really helps to kind of just ground everything together. Okay, so first, since we already have a material and this is going to be the easiest texture we create, let's just select our ground, and then I'm going to take this material and just left click and just drag and drop and place that here into the layer stack. And so Substance Painter computes this, and here we have kind of our ocean ground plane really fast. So what I'm going to do is just change a couple of these parameters for this substance. So for example, I think I'm going to turn off this grass. For the pebble amount, I'm just going to increase this all the way to 1 here. And then I'm going to come over to my technical parameters, and I'm going to set my normal intensity all the way up here to 1. And here, let's just kind of rotate this around. And let's take a look. Okay, so yeah, this is going to work for us for our ground here. Now, we also have this ambient occlusion intensity. So if we look at our channels for this substance, we can see that this substance material is outputting ambient occlusion. Well, if we look at the texture set here for this ground, we don't have an ambient occlusion channel by default. We can fix that really easily by just clicking this plus button and then choosing ambient occlusion. Now, if you saw really quickly here, we start to get an additional ambient occlusion effect here, which is driven by our substance. So here, I'm just going to increase that intensity value. So let's try around 0.8 or so. And let's go with, well, let's back it down a little bit, maybe 0.77. All right, so let's go with something like this for now. And just like that, we're done with our ground plane. So that was, like I said, the quickest texture we're going to work with. Next, I'm going to start to work here with our core. So here, I'm going to take the rings, just turn that off, and the tube weeds, we're going to turn that off. So we're just going to focus here on the core, and then we have this ground as well. So one of the things that I want to do before I start getting into all the material work is that I want to start to paint some extra detail on here. So this was a higher res mesh to begin with, but there's a lot of smaller detail that's missing. Now, like I said, I didn't model that into a high res and then try to bake that down. I'm going to use Painter's ability to paint the normal or height data directly to just do that much more fast in a more non-destructive way. So here on this layer, we're going to call this details. This is just a standard paintable layer that's just what's happened to be here in the layer stack. Then I'm going to come over here to the material for this guy, and I'm going to turn off all of these channels except for normal. And then here on my shelf, I'm going to come over to this hard surfaces section, and you can see we have all these little normal map textures, and I'm going to use these directly. So for example, I'm going to grab like one of these normal maps and just drag and drop that here into the normal channel. Now, when I'm working with these normal textures, you can see my brush has this kind of feathering. That feathering is coming from the actual alpha. So if I click this alpha button, you can see I have this kind of round alpha shape. So since I'm using the normal texture, I want to use that directly. I just take this alpha and I hit the X button here just to get rid of it. So now you can see that I have the full texture. So here, with this in place, what I can do now is just come in and just start to stamp in some additional detail here. So for example, we'll just left click and we'll just stamp this little normal detail down. And then what I can do is just go across the mesh, start using a bunch of these different normal textures and just stamping in extra detail. And you can see it's a very quick, kind of non-destructive way for me to add higher res data without having to go through the process of modeling and baking it. Okay, so I've just gone through and, like I said, just added a bunch of extra details just using various normal stamps here. And so now that that's done, I have these details, but these details are not, they're not contributing to the overall ambient occlusion that I had baked. So we had this ambient occlusion that we baked as part of our additional map. So in order to add that, what I'm going to do is come in here to my channels, and again, I'm going to add an ambient occlusion channel. Now notice I'm doing it this time here for this core material. Now, with this details selected, I'm going to come over to my effects, and I'm going to add a filter. I'm going to click my filter button here and just scroll down, and I'm going to use this horizon-based ambient occlusion. And so I'll use this. Now, for the channel source, I need to set this here to normal. And then as I do that, you can see that now these normal details that I added now have ambient occlusion contributing to the overall ambient occlusion here with that's placed here in my additional map. And that's because the ambient occlusion option here is set to multiply. So this is mixing whatever ambient occlusion detail that I paint, or in this case, create with a filter, with any ambient occlusion that I baked here in my additional maps. And then I also have the ability to go in here to my radius. So here you can see if I kind of turn this up, it just kind of darkens everything and so on. I can also, increase this blur intensity, radius, and, like I said, lots of options here for this. Okay, so now that we have this in place, this is our details, and we have ambient occlusion, we can start to look at creating our materials now. Now, one last thing I want to do on this detail layer is I'm going to right-click on this, and I'm going to choose to add an anchor point for this. And we're going to use this a bit later when, again, we start to create our materials. Speaking of which, let's start to create our first material here. So what I'm going to do is come up here to my layer stack, and I'm going to create a new fill, and this here is going to just be called our rust. And let's see here, we're going to have color. Let's disable our height, our metal, normal, and ambient occlusion. So we're just going to have a roughness value. You can see I'm setting it pretty high. And here for the base color, what I'm going to do is come over here to my shelf. So let's just come over here to all. And if I start to type in project, you can see that this is just going to, filter a lot of assets that I've imported here into my project. So here we have this rust. And what I'm going to do is just left click and drag and drop this right here onto this base color channel. And now we have this rust here being filled based on this fill layer. Okay, so the next thing we want to do, I can look at this triplanar setting. So if I move around here towards, let's say, this side where I have a seam, this is a seam caused by my UVs. So I can get rid of that by just changing this here to triplanar. And so now, right where that seam is, that UV seam, you can see we get a nice continuous texture. So that's what we want to do. Also, I can adjust my UV scale on this guy, and maybe I want to do that. Here, let's just set it to a nice even 2 here for our UV scale. And then, like I said, we also have this roughness here. So for this rust, we're going to keep it rough. Now, in this particular case, I don't have any height information based on this roughness input. Now, I could maybe try to, generate that if I had access to maybe bitmap to material, or I could do that in Substance Designer. In my case, I don't have it. And as you'll see, as we build up some of this material blending, it really won't matter anyways. So, like I said, that's why I'm choosing to use just color and rough at this stage. Okay, so really that takes care of our rust for now. So now let's create another fill layer here, and this is going to be our paint. And this is going to have color, height, rough. Let's keep metal. Let's turn off these guys here. Now our metal for this is going to be 0 because this is kind of this is going to be our painted layer. It's going to act as our dielectric. So let's start with just a color. So I'm going to try to choose a color here. So I'm doing something like this, kind of an orangish, kind of red color. So we get this. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to come over here in the HSV values, and for my saturation, I'm going to desaturate this color because in our underwater environment, a lot of the colors are going to be muted. So I'm going to help with this effect by just dropping the saturation here for this color that I'm choosing. So again, I'm just playing around with these colors. Let's do maybe something more like this, and then once again, just desaturate it a bit. Okay, so I think we could probably work with this for now. And let's see, what else do I want to do with this? Yeah, we want to work with our roughness. So right now we have our roughness and at a value of 0. This is what we're getting. And then we have this value of 1 here. So I think what I would like to do here, on our paint layer, there's so many different ways you can do this. This is just kind of a technique I like to use. So we're going to come in here and I'm going to add a fill as an effect to my fill layer. And you can see the fill effect works just like a fill layer. We have all these channels. So in this case, what I'm going to do is just turn everything off except for this roughness. Now you can see this one, this uniform slider here is, well, it's also driving my roughness. But in this case, I'm going to add a grunge map here. So I'm going to click my button. Here this mini shelf appears, and I can filter this as well. So I'm going to start to look through these grunge maps. and try to find a grunge map that I think might work. Maybe, let's see, that grunge scratches could be cool. Let's do this one, grunge rough dirty. So we'll enable this. Now, right now it's kind of hard to see. So what I like to do is drop into the actual channel. So I hit C on the keyboard, cycle through my channels, and here's my roughness. Now I can see right now I'm getting this seam. So let's get rid of that right off the bat by activating triplanar. Then I'm going to adjust my UV scale to tile this procedural material. Then here, since this is an actual substance itself, I can start to play around with some of the substance parameters. So maybe something like this. We can increase our contrast, get something that looks like this. Okay, so now let me hit M on the keyboard and we go back. And if I hold down the Shift key, right mouse button, and kind of move my light around and get an idea on how this roughness map is going to be affecting my surface. So let's see here. One of the things I'm going to do with this guy, so you'll notice that all the effects, they also have a whole set of blending modes as well, just like a layer. So what I'm going to do is come over here to this roughness channel selector, which is basically going to let me know that now when I choose my blending mode, it's going to be setting this mode for the roughness channel. And I might set this to say something like multiply. And so now that that's set to multiply, again, I'm just hitting C key to go back through my channels here. Let me get into my roughness. Okay, it's really, really dark. So what I'm going to do now is come back here to this main fill, and you'll notice that I now still have this uniform slider, and it's set to 0 almost. So as I start to increase this value, you can see that now what I get is this slider acts like an overall kind of global roughness adjustment slider that I have here. So I could get different effects. Like for instance, if I came in and set this to maybe subtract, this is what I'm going to get. So it's basically kind of like the opposite effect. So really, I might want to just do this, I think. So I could do this. I could set this to something like, say, max lighten. And again, I get a different effect here. So like I said, let's maybe set that to subtract and do something more like this here. All right, so I'll hit M on the keyboard to go back to my material mode, and I think I'm going to leave it something like this here. Okay, so that's going to take care of my roughness on this. Again, we can always go back and tweak it if we want to. Okay, so that is going to take care of our roughness. Now, when you add fill layers like this as an effect, you can also double-click this and then rename it. So it always helps to rename so you can get a quick kind of visual cue on what that effect's doing. All right, so now we have that in place. I want to do another fill effect, and this time I'm going to focus on working with the height channel. So we'll click our Add Effect, and I'm going to choose Add Fill. And here, while we are here, let's just call Height. And I'm going to switch this mode here to height. And for the mode, it's set to linear dodge. And whenever you add a height channel in Designer, whether it be a fill effect or a fill layer or anything like that, it's going to set its blending mode to linear dodge, which means it's basically, it's like add mode, and it's basically just going to always add up all your height like this. In my case, what I want to do, again, is I'm going to set this one to multiply. And I'll show you what that means here in just a moment. So for now, let's just kill all these channels here so we just have our height. And in this channel, I'm going to do the same thing. This time I'm going to just type in BW, and it's going to filter out some of these black and white spot filter noises. And I'm going to start this first one here, black and white spots 1. So I'll add this. And you can see that, well, I don't see anything. Nothing's happening. So what's going on here? Well, if I go up to the fill layer, again, we have our height. Now notice it's set to 0. If I start to take this value slider now and push it towards the negative, now I'm getting this kind of dented effect here. Or if I take this value and I push it towards the positive, now it's starting to kind of protrude out like this. So this is starting to give me, again, a different type of bumpy effect. So what I'll do here is go back to this height. And again, this is a substance material, so I'm going to use its parameters to, kind of really tweak this effect. So the position, I'm just going to shrink this or, push this in like this and then play around with my contrast. Also, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set this to triplanar, and then I'm going to adjust my UV scale so to get something like this, and then again, adjust my position. So what I'm trying to do here, just kind of for this paint layer, is this is just kind of represent some of this kind of paint buildup specs or whatever on this overall paint. And now, again, going back to my paint fill, I have this nice kind of global control for my height now. So again, if I wanted to push this the other way, this would be really good if I was doing concrete here. See, it already gives you like a different feel based on just what that height is here. Okay, so again, if I just push this out forward, this is the effect. So what I'm going to do is just, it's not going to be really intense, just a small effect like this here. So now that we have our paint effect, I'm going to introduce a mask. So to start this process, I'm going to right click and choose to add a black mask. And so black, it's fully transparent, and that's why we see the rust layer underneath of it. And with this mask layer selected, I'm going to come over here to my generators. I'm going to add a generator, and then I'm going to come over to the generator tab, and I'm going to choose this mask editor. So we'll choose this. And now what we're going to do is come over here and start to play around with some of these settings. So for example, our curvature. So I'm going to move this all the way up. And this is what we're getting so far. And it's, we need to do some tweaks first. But it can be hard to see what's actually happening at this stage. So what I like to do is come over here to the mask. You can hold down the Alt key and then left click on the mask. And this puts us in mask view mode. And now we can really see what's happening here with this. So if we come back here to our mask editor, and here for the curvature, this slider, we set it to 1, which fully activates curvature. Then we'll come in and I'm going to start to just play around with some of these settings here. So let's see, what do we have here? So maybe, let's see, we'll set it like this so far. Now, the next thing we want to do is I'm also going to add some a texture here to this texture tab. Now, so what I want to do first is come up here to this global settings here, and we have this global invert. So I'm just going to enable this, which basically, well, it's just going to invert everything that I'm doing here. So now if I hit M on the keyboard to go back, we start to, get an invert of the effect. And now you can see I'm starting to get some of this rust kind of on the edges, which is what I want to do. But we need to make some tweaks. So here for this global balance, if I start to tweak this here, so we'll back this off, you can see that, okay, now I'm starting to get a little bit more of what I wanted, which is this rust on the edges or the curve based on what I have here, which is my curvature mask input. Now I can start to play around with some of these curvature settings here. So let's see what I'm getting. So I don't want to use this big slider, so I'm going to back this one all the way off. Okay, so let's start like this for now. All right, and I think the next thing I'm going to do is take a look at this ambient occlusion. So I'm going to start to push this ambient occlusion in, and you can see that, well, as I start to increase ambient occlusion, it's making some of this rust disappear, and that's because by default this guy was set to multiply. So here, what I can do is maybe set this here to max lighten, and then what I'm going to do is choose this invert mode. And now if I come over here to the balance of this guy, I can start to add, some of this rust more kind of in this occluded area. Another way that you could work with this, so maybe we don't want to work with ambient occlusion, we come back, let's make sure our curvature is all the way on. We come back to curvature, we could set the mode from edges, then we have cavities, we could set it to dual. And that'll do a similar effect as well. However, you can see that it's still more concentrated on the edges based on what we have here. So sometimes what I like to do is just keep this here on edges and then use my ambient occlusion with a max lighten and inverted to get this effect here. So I'm going to take my ambient occlusion and drag this all the way up here to 1 and then just play around with this balance setting like this. So in the case of this rust, this is kind of giving me this overall look that we have so far. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is introduce a texture into this as well. So here underneath my texture inputs, I'm going to click this button, and in the mini shelf that appears, I'm going to type grunge, and let's see, I'm just going to scroll down through here, and I'm going to use this map here. It's getting cut off in the screen capture. You can probably see a small piece of it, but it's called grunge map 004. So I'm going to use this one here. We've added it, but we don't see it, and that's because if we come up here to our texture, the value's set to 0. So let's add this in here to a value of 1 at this point. All right, so now I'm starting to get some effect here. So I can really see what's happening again with this mask. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and left click on the mask so I can just view the mask mode itself. And here back in our mask editor, let's come back to this texture tab. And for triplanar, let's enable this. So we'll enable our triplanar effect. And I can adjust my scale like this. So I might want to adjust my scale. And then I want to maybe look at my global balance again here as well. So let's see. Let's do something like more. Let's increase that overall global balance. Now I can see where I'm getting some of that curvature issue again. So what I'm going to do is go back here to my curvature settings. and play around with some of these guys. Let's see what I can get here. And let's go back up here to that texture. Get something like this. Okay, so now I'll hit M on the keyboard to go back, and so now I'm just getting an idea of what's happening here with this overall rust and how this is working for me. All right, so again, it comes down to a lot of tweaking. I'm going to come back here to this, let's see, maybe this huge slider. Let's come in and bring this guy here. And then I'm going to come over to my global contrast and just increase this up pretty high. Okay, so now we're starting to get more of what I want. All right, so that'll take care of our rust at this stage. So now we have our painted effect, and then, you know, we're using this mask that we've generated here to create, you know, to kind of peel away some of that paint so that we could see that underlying rust material. Okay, so another thing that we need to do, we have our mask set, but you can see that with our painted details that we have, so if we come over and look at these painted details, it's not really taking these this normal detail into consideration when we're creating our mask here. And so that's why we use this anchor, and you can see that we have this details anchor. So here, back in the mask editor, let's just close up all these options here so we can get kind of a more clear view of what's happening. We can come here to our image inputs, and you can see that I have this micro normal. So I'm going to click this button, and then here, this time I'm going to go to the anchors tab, and then here you can see that this detail anchor is available. So I'm going to use this. And then for the referenced channel, I'm going to set it to normal because that's what we're working with, the normal channel. Now, if I just scroll up, you can see that we have this micro details section. So we'll expand this, and then I just want to come here and enable my micro normal. And so when I do that, you can see that now what we get here is this grunge or this rust is now appearing where we painted all those extra normal details. So what I can do here is start to just tweak a bit here, things like this curvature intensity, AO radius, and so on. So maybe by default, I think it was a bit too intense. So what I'm going to do is just make a small tweak here to this curvature. So this curvature intensity, you can see that I'm just lowering it. And now when we look at this detail, you can see that, okay, now it's kind of following along with these this normal detail that I had painted earlier. All right, so now that's working. Here you can see we have this little handle piece and so on, and that's more in line with what I want to do. Okay, so now that we have that in place, we have our paint and we have our rust. What I'd like to do is go a little further with this and add more of like a paint peeling type effect. So in order to do that, we're going to create another fill layer here on top, and I'm just going to call this peeling. And for this, we want to just take our height and rough. And for this height value, we're going to set it around 0.2. And our roughness here, actually, I'm going to, well, we'll leave it like this for now. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is right-click and create a black mask for this. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a fill. Now, we need to get this data from this mask editor up here to this fill. And so what we need to do is come back here into our mask, and we're going to anchor this as well. So I'm going to right-click, and then here I'm just going to create an anchor point. And this is going to be called paint mask, so it's paint, and then it's mask because I'm doing this here in kind of a mask channel system. So now we'll go back here to our fill, and again, for this grayscale, I'm going to click this, and I'm going to go to the anchor points tab, and this time I'm going to choose this paint a mask. So here, if I hold down the Alt key and left click, you can see that basically it's now taking the effects of this mask generator and pushing it up right into this fill layer. So any changes I make to this mask editor are automatically going to update here in this fill layer. So here, if we wanted to, we could just call this rust mask, so we can just get an idea of what this is. Okay, so what we want to do, kind of the way I like to look at this is, you know, to create some type of edge matte to this, what we want to do is basically blur it, invert the mask, and then, you know, kind of place it back inside of itself or multiply it back inside of itself. And that's just kind of what I usually say to myself to kind of remember how to do these types of effects. So here we have the rust mask, and like I said, first thing we want to do is we're going to add a filter here. So add a filter, and we're going to blur it. So we'll come in and add a blur. And so this is, we're blurring the mask now. Then the next thing is we're going to add a levels. So we're going to blur it, invert it. So to invert, we just hit this invert button. And now we want to make an adjustment here to the input black and white. So I'm just going to take the input black and just move it up this way like this. And we'll probably adjust all this here in a moment. So here's our levels. Now, what I want to do again is add a fill. And then here, we're going to grab that reference again. So here's our paint mask. And then we're going to set the blending mode to this guy here to multiply. And so by doing that, you can see if I zoom in, we start to get this kind of outer edge matte here. And we can adjust that with this levels command. Like I said, we might want to try to tweak this here a little bit. So we can do things like this. You know, it just depends on how intense we want to make this effect. So here, let's make this adjustment here. So we'll do this. Now, here our blur, this is going to almost be like the driving distance to this. So you can see as I start to drag this blur intensity to a low value, we get, you know, a very small kind of edge. And then as we, you know, increase this blur, we're going to get more edge and so on. And then, again, it could just be, you know, a matter of coming in and just trying to tweak this to get what we really want. So maybe something more like this here. So now when I hit M on the keyboard, we're going to start to get some of this paint peeling effect. Here I can see that I really need to adjust this based on what I'm seeing here in my material view. So now let's go back and start to just make some tweaks to this. Okay, so now we're seeing more of kind of this peeling edge here. So let's do like maybe this. Let's go back to that blur, increase that a little bit. Okay, so there we go. So now we're starting to get some of that peeling effect. All right, so here I'm going to go back to this layer, and I could also increase or decrease here my height. So we'll keep it maybe at a value like this, and then also let's look at this roughness here. So like I said, what I'm going to do is I might set this around 0.1 or so. And so that's going to take care of that peeling effect. All right, so now the next stage of this is I'm going to add another fill layer, and this time I'm going to call this Grime. And let's just disable all of our channels. Let's take the rough pretty high in this case, and then let's set a color to this. What I might do is start with here just taking a sample here of a kind of a color value and make it just a little more kind of a value like this here, desaturate it. So this is going to be like an overall kind of color. Now we're going to choose a black mask to this, and I'm going to add a generator. And for the generator, I'm just going to use this MG dirt like this here. So now what we'll do is just play around with some of this dirt level, this kind of grunge amount to this. Again, it's a matter of just tweaking away. So I think what I want to do is maybe make this a little bit more kind of like this value and so on. So this is giving us, this is the mask that we're creating here with this. And then we'll go back here to our material mode, and that is going to help just kind of integrate everything together now with the ground here is what I'm really doing with this grime layer here. So it's kind of like the grime or integration layer to that. All right, so that's going to take care of our overall material at this stage of what we have. So now what I could do with this, or typically what I could do with this would be, so I have these layers, which is something I could reuse, you know, time and time again. So first off, I need to make sure I save. I haven't done that in a while. Let's create a group here to this, and then what I could do is just select all these layers and just drag and drop them right here into this group like this. All right, and then for this folder, we could just call this, I'll just say rusted paint, I guess. So now we have this group, and I could right-click, and I could save this as a smart material, so I could reuse this in other projects and so on. But what I want to do is I'm going to instance this to some of my other layers. So for instance, if we come back here, we have our rings. So we haven't done any texturing on this rings yet. But now that we've done all of the work here on this core, we can just simply instance this over to our rings. So I'm going to right-click here, and I'm going to choose to instantiate this across texture sets. And let's see, I'm going to disable my ground. I'm going to choose rings here, and then click OK. And just like that, you can see that I've now just textured the rings. And I'm done with that. So if I come back here to my core, which, let's see here. Yeah, let's go back to our core. And if I expose, or if I go back and look at my values here, let's say that I go to my paint layer and I want to switch the color to, I don't know, like a blue or something. Now I can do that, and it updates everything as I work. And wow, now that I'm kind of here, I might like this a little better or something. So let's just play around with some of these values. You know, see if we want to make any changes or something like that. So the instantiation here allows us to make changes and then again have those changes propagate to all of our texture sets really quickly. So it's a very powerful feature here. So again, I'm just trying to find a color that I want to use. Actually, I think I might just go with something more like this time. Okay, so that's going to take care of my vent asset here. And now I can go back. Let's see, maybe my rust, I might want to, let's see if I could look at maybe tiling this a little bit more, if that makes it better. And I think it does, because I was seeing a little bit blurry. So I'm just kind of tiling that texture more just to get, more of resolution out of it. So maybe I'll do something more like that. And again, it's updating across both the core and the rings texture sets as I work. Okay, so here we have that in place. The next thing that I'm going to take a look at here are just these weeds now. So let's enable these. And so this is going to be kind of like the tube weeds. So we'll click this layer here to get back to that. Okay, let's see here what I want to do. I'm going to do something pretty simple with this. So here, what I'm going to do is come into a fill layer. And so on this fill layer, let's just undo. Let's turn off all these channels. So this is our roughness. I'm actually going to leave it kind of like, I don't know, maybe around between 0.2 and 0.3. And then here for the color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this button. And I'm going to do a search here for a gradient. And then here, I'm going to use this guy. Now, it's completely cut off from the screen capture, but it's called Gradient Linear 1. So I'm going to use Gradient Linear 1. And so here, you can see that, well, because of this gradient, we have a real dark value here towards the bottom. And then as we go up towards the top, it's more of a brighter value here. And so now that I have a gradient here, what I'm going to do is go to my effects, and I'm going to add, let's say, a filter here. Now, and for the filter, what I'm going to do is add the gradient node. So here we have this gradient filter. So we'll use this guy. And here, this allows us to have up to 10 different positions that we can use, and it's going to use the grayscale gradient that we placed in this base color, and it's going to allow us to, well, colorize that. So for example, for color 1, what I'm going to do is come in and choose something like kind of like a darker green value like this. And then for color 2, let's come in and choose something like a little like brighter. Do something like this. And then here for color 3, do something more a little yellow like this. And then we can also choose to use these position values here to change that, how the gradient is being distributed here, or how these color values are being distributed across the gradient. All right, so now that we have the base color, let's do a little variation on this. So here I'm going to add another fill layer. This is just going to be our color. And I don't know, let's just try something like maybe like a bright yellow for now. We'll probably change this. And then here I'm going to add a black mask. And then within this mask, I'll just add a fill. And then here, I'm just going to add a grunge map in here. So let me just try to find something that I could probably use. This grunge galvanic large. So we'll use this. And again, it's really hard to see. So what I like to do, Alt left click here so I can get an idea of what this mask is doing. So now let's go in and let's just play around with this. I'm going to set it to triplanar. And then I have my balance setting here. So here, let's also do our contrast. So we'll get something like this. Okay, then we'll hit M on the keyboard. And then we'll come back and just play around with this color here. So let's try to do something more like, this here. So now what we get is just a little variation. Here's what we had before, and here we have just a little variation in that to kind of just break things up a bit. Okay, so that's going to take care of the tube weeds. And so now we're ready to start looking at setting this up for a render. So in order to do that, I'm going to click this camera icon, which is going to take me into Iray mode here inside of Painter. So we'll click this button here. It's going to take just a moment for Iray to kick in. And then we're going to start kind of our rendering here. So here's what we have so far. Now, what we want to do, let's come over here to our display settings, viewer settings, dome. And for the ground, I'm going to turn that off because I don't want to have a ground appearing with shadow and stuff. Okay, so we have that. Here I can hold down the shift key, right mouse button, just like we could in the real-time viewport. And let's just see if we can't get a nice kind of like little lighting setup here. Maybe I want to do something that's a little bit more backlit like this. Okay, there. Change just a little bit of more directional light. Okay, so we'll do something like this here. Now, what we want to do is come back over here to our display settings. And like I said, we activated these post effects. Now I'm going to activate this glare here. And so now that we've activated the glare, we're starting to get, again, like I said, some more perspective here from, just to kind of give us the feeling that we're actually in water. So let's come back to our glare and just play around with some of this stuff. So what I'm going to do is lower the threshold, maybe increase the luminance here a little bit more. Again, I might just move this light around. All right, then we have our vignette. We'll pull our vignette down. For our color correction, I'm going to enable my color correction. And then for the white balance here, I'm going to start to lower this just to give it more kind of a bluer tint to it. Then I can start to play around with my overall brightness. Here, let's also enable tone mapping and play around with our gamma. So let's see here. I'm going to lower my exposure so that glare is not just blowing out so much here. That, in turn, allows me to go back to this glare and just increase it more. So we'll do something more like this. Now, here for this shape, I'm going to set this to be bloom. Okay, so now we're getting this. And like I said, we can play around with things like our exposure and our gamma. So let's go back over here to our color correction. I'm constantly going back and forth between color correction and tone mapping. So here I might increase that contrast. You know what? I'm not going to do that. I'll leave contrast at 1 and just start to play around with some of these things here. So let's pull our gamma up a little bit. Maybe my brightness here. Play around with my color. My saturation. I'm going to increase saturation slightly. And again, I think I'm just going to play around with my lighting angle. Okay, so here's the look I'm getting so far, and like I said, I just dropped this threshold down, and my luminance is up pretty high, and again, like I said, this is giving me that underwater kind of murky perspective that we're getting here. Now, my goal for this was just to see what I could do as far as an underwater scene goes with what's available to me right here in Painter with just the post-effect settings that I have. Okay, so here we can also go in and work with our depth of field. So this depth of field is a post-process. What I'm going to use is the actual depth of field here, which is going to be a 3D depth of field. So as I increase my aperture, you can see everything's really blurry. So now I'll hold down the control key and middle mouse click, and that will set this focal distance for me. So I can just click, for example, if I want to do like something like close here, it just lets me interactively adjust what that focal depth is going to be. So I might zoom in a little bit more here, and then control middle click, and then adjust that aperture setting so it's not so intense. So we'll try getting something more like this. Okay, so I think I have everything set up the way I want. Let's see, anything else I want to do here? Again, I might just do my vignette a little bit more. Now, here, I haven't set up what I'm going to do for my camera yet. So here, I need to set up my resolution for this. And so I'm going to scroll down here at the top. Now, I have this override viewport resolution option. So if I turn that on, you can see now I'm doing, a 1920 by 1200 resolution image. And so this is kind of what I want to shoot for in terms of my resolution. So now I'm just going to kind of frame things up with this new render resolution that I have. Here I need to reset my focal distance. Maybe I'll go back to that aperture and just pull that down a little bit more. Okay, so here we go. At this stage, I have my image rendering and ready. One other thing I'll kind of mention, you'll notice here that the status says done here for the render. Iray's really easy. It just continuously refines until you get the result that you want. So for example, here you have min samples and max samples. So the way this is working is this render is going to render for 10 seconds. And if it hits 10 seconds before it hits that max samples, it's done. If it hits the max samples before it hits the max time, then it's done rendering. So for, in this case, what I could do, well, I just did 10 seconds. Maybe I could come in here and do 60 seconds. So this is going to do a 1-minute rendering. And it's going to do that up until it hits either 60 seconds or that max samples, whichever one comes first. And so I'm just going to let this refine for a minute. And when that's ready, I'm then going to be able to either save my render, or I can just use the ArtStation share to upload this directly to ArtStation. And that's what I'm going to do here in this video. And you can see right now about halfway through, about 35 seconds or so, 39 and counting. You can see here for my iterations, this is talking about the sampling. So here is that max 1000. We're at 402. So we're definitely going to hit our time limit before we hit our max samples. All right, so we're ready to go. Like I said, I'm going to share this to ArtStation, so I just click this ArtStation button. All you have to do is log into your ArtStation account. So here I'll click log in. All right, so now I've logged in, and then all I have to do is just click this upload button. So we'll click upload. And so here you can see this is uploading, and when that's done, a browser window is going to open for me. All right, so I'm just going to drag that here into view, and then it asks me which project do I want to use, or do I want to upload to a new project. So here I'll click upload to a new project. And then here you can see that it sets up my project. So here's where I can go in and type, like, my project details and so on, and the image is already set for me. So that's going to conclude this tutorial. I hope you find this useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.